Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm combining die cuts with interference inks. No surprise, I love interference inks. Using the new Lisa Horton Summertime Collection with Spellbinders. We have the Stargazers die cut, we have the Garden Planter die cut. This is the Containers and Foliage die set. Then we have the Ripped Edge Circles die set. To me, this looks like a wood piece cut on crosswise, if you will. And I love how many layers that has. Then we have the open laced frame and landscape die set. Absolutely adorable. This is the Decorative Lattice die. For a lot of these dies, I'll be using them in a couple different ways. The Stargazers, I'll be using them through most of the cards because I absolutely love them. Then we have the Love and Hugs Stampin' Die set, as well as the So Amazing Stampin' Die set. I love that we have a large sentiment here with some sub-sentiment stamps. I'm going to start off with heat embossing those sub-sentiments so that I have them there ready to go to pick while I'm doing my card making. Now, I haven't used these sets yet, so I'm going to use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps those stamps take ink a little bit better, and then I'll brush off any possible eraser bits that are there. These two stamp sets will fit on a A2 piece of Hammermill cardstock, so I can stamp and emboss them at one time. I'm going to position them on there. I'm going to use a little bit of embossing powder tool just to make sure that my embossing powder sticks just to my stamped sentiments. I'm going to use some embossing ink in order to stamp them. I like to stamp them a couple times just to make sure that we have a full crisp image there. So I'm using some Versamark ink. Any embossing ink here will work. You could even just use colored ink if you wanted to just stamp your sentiments, but I do tend to prefer sub-sentiments that have that heat embossing. It just adds that extra little bit of texture. For these cards, I'm using some gold embossing powder. You can use whatever color you want. It will work with whatever color embossing powder you have. And then I'm going to use my embossing tool in order to melt that powder completely. And it goes from a granular rough texture to a nice smooth glossy gold texture. And it really enhances those sentiments, I think, when they're embossed. But again, you can just use any ink that you prefer and stamp them. Now, if you wanted to use the interference inks that I'm going to be using for blending, you could use them for stamping your sentiments. However, you're not going to see the shimmer quite as much with stamping, as well as the fact that the pads are foam pads, so they have a lot of give to them. So you will want to be careful and err on the side of caution with them. Don't press too hard with the stamp pad. Otherwise, you're just going to waste a whole lot of ink on the recessed part of that stamp. Once I have those embossed, I'm going to match the dies, and I like to tape them in place with a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape in order to make sure that those dies are going to stay on exactly where I want them to go. I'm going to stamp them individually because die cut them individually because the dies would have overlapped otherwise. We don't want to ever have our dies overlapping when putting them through the die cutting machine. That's the first way to ruin them. So I'm going to do them at 2 different times. Look at how many sentiments all at one time so easily. And some of these sentiments could be mixed and matched with the other set. So I love that you can use these not only with the set that they're in, but they'll often work with other sets as well. Or sometimes you can just use those sub-sentiments on their own and they will work on their own. So you don't have to use them with the large die cut word if you don't want to. Some of them only really work with the word, they only make sense with the word, but some of them work without as well. So I have a bunch of the pieces from the Stargazer here, as well as the Love and Hugs Stampin' Die set and the Containers and Foliage for putting in my Stargazers here. So I have some of those leaves already assembled on my stems. There's 4 different stems in this set, and they are labeled A, B, C, D, and then the leaf overlay pieces are also labeled A, B, C, D, so you know exactly which one of those leaf overlay dies goes which one of the stems. So very smart, very organized, and I really appreciate the fact that it was labeled like that. It made it so much easier to know exactly which overlay pieces go with which stem. Now, for some of my word die cuts here, I'm using solid hot foil pieces with aura foil from past projects. You could also just use gold cardstock if you want, but I always love the holographic finish for the aura as well as the prism foil. I love how it coordinates really well with other colors as well. So I have my pieces for my lilies die cut out of some Hammermill cardstock. Before using the interference ink, I used the natural pearl pad to ink blend over top of that flower, just so that the edges of the cardstock would be shimmery as well, and then went in with the pink champagne interference ink just to do the center parts of those flowers. Now you don't really see the shimmer from the natural pearl, so I don't do it in other flowers. I only did it with this one, but once I was done and you couldn't really tell that it was done, I just figured there's no point in doing this. Now you can see, looking at my flowers here, I kind of ink blended them really oddly, but that's based on how they layer together. So this one here that I'm only doing that one petal to, the one underneath it layers on top of it, so you don't see anything underneath, so there's no point in wasting time with blending those pieces. I am using a detailed ink blending brush for those flowers because I do want the edges of the flowers to be white or the natural pearl color. For some of the flowers that I'm going to create with other cards in this video, I'll be using different combinations of the interference ink, so we have a little bit of a variety of colors. When looking at what color Stargazer lilies are supposed to be, they came up with a variety of different colors. Some of them I'm not sure if they're actually real or not, but I really love them, and I love non-traditional colors with them anyways. And when we card make, we can do whatever color combinations we want to get the results that we want, to get the color combinations or looks that we want. So I'm just going to have fun with some of those color combinations. So I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle in order to layer those pieces together. I'm working on a tacky mat here so that it holds my pieces while I'm doing that ink blending. I'm also going to be using some Summer Garden interference ink on those leaves and stems, and I do that after the assembly. Those overlay pieces are really quite tiny and would be a little bit of a challenge just to do those pieces, so I assembled them together first before adding that interference ink over top. Once I have those pieces assembled, I'm adding them to an A2 card base here. So I like to put my vase down first, but because I'm using that liquid glue, I can easily lift it up before it's dry to add those stems right in there. It just saves putting those stems on the background of my card and not necessarily having them placed exactly how I would like them to be. Now, once I have those all placed in there, I can add my sentiment as well as my sub-sentiment. I love using the liquid glue because you don't really need to use a whole lot. And by having it in that fine bottle, I can use it for assembly die cut or die cut assembly, as well as assembling my cards. And I can use as much or as little as I need on the back of each one of those die cuts. And it gives you that little bit of wiggle room in order to be able to move and shimmy things in place. Once I have those die cuts assembled, I like to put an acrylic block on top just to hold everything down nice and flat. It frees up my hands for working with other things or doing other things while waiting for things to dry. Waiting for things to dry is my least favorite thing to do, so I always like to fill in my time while doing that. So for this card, I used two different sub-sentiment that worked well with that Hugs sentiment die cut. You could easily just use one, or you could even just use that word all on its own. For the second card, I'm going to be using the Garden Planter die set. I have all of my pieces here die cut out of some Fawn Cardstock, and I want to add a little bit of visual dimension to them. So I'm using a little bit of Vintage Photo Distress ink to those die cuts before assembly. I have my large blending brush here and I'm just kind of rubbing it on the edges of those die cuts. The base of the planter, I don't need to put any ink blending on there. We're going to be putting these pieces on that part, so we're not going to see any of that, so there's no point. And then the upper rim pieces that are right at the top of my screen there for that barrel, I didn't bother putting them on, or putting the ink on those as well, because we're going to have these floral die cuts that are going to be covering them anyways. So again, we're not going to see it, so there's no point in putting ink on there. I used some Anchor cardstock for the little straps for the barrel. Another option here would be to use some silver metallic cardstock, or to use the Anchor cardstock and then add silver metallic ink from Lisa Horton's metallic inks. That's another product. If you wanted to create it or make it look a little bit more like an aged barrel that had metal straps that were a little bit worn and corroded, you could easily do that and create that look there. I just left it with the Anchor cardstock there because the florals to me are more the star of this rather than the barrel itself, but those are another options to change it up. For these florals here, I have them die cut out of Hammermill Cardstock, and I'm using the Sweet Treat interference pad as well as the Fruit Salad interference pad to color them. I don't use yellows and oranges often when I'm creating florals because they're my least favorite colors. but I did want to create something with this that was nice and bright. You could even take these florals and use a bunch of different colors with them, and that would look gorgeous as well. For the base of those florals, when I was using the Sweet Treat, I used a larger ink blending brush, and then for the inside part, I want that to blend into the Sweet Treat, so I'm using a detailed ink blending brush, so I have a little bit more control over it, working in a clockwise and counterclockwise motion, so that when my ink sits on the edges of those cardstock pieces, it's not uneven. So by working in both directions, it gets it a little bit more on the even side. For this card, I'm using the So Amazing stamp and die set for that sentiment. So the So part, I die cut it out of white cardstock and then use that fruit salad interference ink to color it so it coordinates with those florals. And then just like before with the greenery for this, I'm using the Summer Garden interference pad. When I do the ink blending on the colored cardstock, I do it kind of like a third to halfway. I don't want the entire piece to be covered with that interference ink. I want part of it to be covered because I want to have the contrast between the regular cardstock and the interference ink. I just love the look of the contrast to it. It really shows off the interference inks in my opinion. So I just do it a part of the way so that we see some of the shimmer and some of the interference part of the interference ink, but we also see the contrast of the regular cardstock. And those are die cut out of Rainforest Cardstock, which is kind of a medium tone green. Now for the centers of the flowers, there are dies for the centers. I'm using that holographic gold cardstock that I showed at the beginning that I used for that I'm using for some of the sentiment die cuts. It was the solid hot foiled piece. I regularly will use my solid hot foiled pieces as a specialty cardstock for die cutting. And like I said before, I love that aura foil because it has that holographic finish and it makes it coordinate really, really well with different colors. It also has a different look to it than just plain gold foiled cardstock, which I also love. Now to coordinate my sub-sentiment with my florals, I use that fruit salad pad to ink blend over top of it. And that embossing resists the interference ink, so we will still see that gold embossing really easily on there, but it's just an easy way to coordinate that sub-sentiment with the florals on this card. So for my sub-sentiment here and my sentiment, I'm putting them towards the bottom of the card here. Last time I put them towards the top. I will often, especially if we have florals in a bucket or here a barrel or a vase, I'll often use that area for some of my sentiments just because to me it's not the most important part of the card, so I don't mind covering that up a little bit. I don't want to cover up my actual florals in the center, so by putting it over top of the barrel, we still see the barrel, we still see exactly where those florals are growing out of, but it condenses the design on the card. So for my florals here, I'm going to add the greenery to the back of my barrel first. Then I'm going to start assembling and laying my florals on the front part. I want to make sure that I have things tucked in behind those florals, and the easiest way to do it is put them down first, but I don't put all of them down. I save some so that after I have my florals in there, if I find that I need to tuck anything in or fill in an area, I still have some greenery in order to do that. Now these flowers have separate petals to them, so I'm using my fingers to kind of round those petals a little bit as I'm assembling. It just gives it a little bit of visual dimension. I don't put anything under those petals. I leave it as is. If you wanted to support that dimension, you can use some foam pop dots underneath there, but I do like to add that little bit of extra dimension. If you want to have a lot of dimension, you can use some styluses and a foam mat to create that, but I find you get enough just by using your fingers, as well as the fact that you have them right there handy, and it's a really quick process to just kind of curve those fingers or curve those petals with your fingers as you're assembling. I'll put the larger florals towards the center, and then I'll start tucking the smaller ones into the side. And you can see that I put some of the smallest ones on the branches in the cluster as well. I didn't feel after I was done that it needed any floral or any more greenery, so I didn't bother adding that. For the next card here, I'm once again using the Stargazers die set, this time pairing it with the Decorative Lattice die for the background. So first off, I'm going to add the little layers to the leaves. For a lot of these cards, I have most of those pieces done, ready to go, and I'll just have one to assemble. I'm using my handy tool set from Spellbinders to assemble it. This tool set comes with 2 different wax tools that have different shapes to the wax tips. It also has a pair of tweezers. It has a piercing tool as well as 2 extra wax tips or replacement wax tips. I really like this one here that has the fine point. It works really well for some of the smaller die cuts as well as when layering different layering sets, because when you're working with those layering sets, the Spellbinders dies will often put a little indentation or indication of where those pieces are going, so you know exactly where to put the glue, so it makes it really easy to pick up those different layers and add it to the layer below. For this Stargazer lily, I'm starting with the lavender fields on the inside of the flowers, and then I'm going to do a little bit of that pink champagne around the outside. So we have purple on the inside and then the pink on the outside. This is where I'm just getting really creative with it. I did see a picture somewhat similar-ish to this online that I said, like I said before, likely not actually a real color combination, but I just thought it would be really, really pretty. And I didn't want to do all of my Stargazers the exact same shade. I wanted to change them up just a little bit. So just like before, I have them ink blended weirdly, simply because there's layers that go over top of each other layer, and there's no point in doing ink blending on the under layers, so that the pieces that you're not going to see anyways. So I'm going to layer those on top of each other. I use that Summer Garden on my leaves as well as just kind of going up the stem a little bit. Then I have the center parts of these flowers. I die cut them out of that gold holographic, or the solid hot foiled gold holographic, just to add that little bit of extra gold there. Another option, if you don't happen to have any specialty cardstock, this Lisa Horton gold pad is absolutely gorgeous, and I will often use it on cardstock and then die cut it. Because I'm using it for the background part of the decorative lattice for this, it would work really, really well to use this on some gold card or on some Hammermill cardstock or plain, whatever cardstock you like for your ink blending, and then die cut those pieces. So that would work well as well for the sentiment dies as well that I have die cut out of that solid hot foil piece. Now my pad was getting really, really dry, so I figured while I was taping, I might as well show how I re-ink it. Now when I re-ink it, first of all, you want to shake up that refill really, really well. Make sure that all of those bits that get separated as it sits are nice and shaken in. Then I will zigzag on my pad. I will let it soak in on its own, and by doing that, I kind of gauge how dry the pad is and how much ink I really need to ink, or how much ink I need to add. And then I'll use the tip of that re-inker bottle to gently massage the ink into the foam, not pressing hard. I'm not gauging or gouging out the foam or anything. I'm just kind of massaging it in there. Another option is to use one of those silicone makeup brushes to use that to massage it into the pad if you don't want that ink sitting towards the top. Typically, I won't ink a pad if I'm going to be using it right away for stamping. In this case, I was using it for ink blending and I was covering an entire background, so I don't mind using it right away. If you use it right away after inking, you haven't given that ink enough time to distribute amongst the pad, so you might get some areas that are heavy and some areas that are light. So you want to be careful to use it, if you do want to use it right away, that you don't know exactly how well the ink is distributed in that pad there. Once I have that piece ink blended, I can add the lattice part on top, and then I'm going to just use that in the for the background of the card and add my Stargazers to the front of it. It just adds a really bold pop of color there. Now I use that ink for that background piece. Again, you could use some specialty cardstock, some gold cardstock if you want, or you could even use that white piece with an interference pad and ink blend it that way. Or if you want to contrast a finish, just use colored cardstock for that background piece would look nice as well. Once I have those florals on there, I can start adding my sentiments. And then we have our finished card here. I really love that pop of metallic that gold gives to the background, and it just really kind of highlights the lattice part as well as the florals in front of it. For the next card, once again, I'm using that decorative lattice, but this time I cut it right out of the front of the card. That decorative lattice die set has the lattice part, and then it has a second die to cut the border part around it. So for the cutting into the card, I only used the inner part. I didn't use the border part, and it's a great way to just change up your card base just a little bit. Now, the one thing that I didn't think about till after editing this video was when I go to glue on my leaves here, you will see some of that glue through that lattice. If that bothers you, you can add another leaf die cut on the inside of the card, or you could just be careful with your glue when you're putting it onto your leaves, and then you won't have to worry about it. But to be honest, the inside of the card doesn't necessarily I don't worry about it too much. I don't think someone's going to pay enough attention to the glue on the back of the leaves on the front of the card. I could be totally wrong. Another option would be to take some colored cardstock or a contrasting color cardstock and put it underneath that lattice part on the inside of the card so that it covers that up. If that's something that bothers you, you could always do that as well. Now, to make sure I'm not getting that glue right through the lattice and gluing my leaf pieces to the back of my card, I have it open while I'm doing that gluing. I did use that Summer Garden Interference ink on my leaf sprig before adding the spine and assembling that, so it does have that interference shimmer to it, and I love the look of it with that open background there. And again, you could put some colored cardstock on the inside of your card if you wanted to show off that contrast even more. For the next two cards, I'm going to be using the Ripped Edge Circles die set. For this first one here, I have the largest die used to cut the shape out of Fawn Cardstock, and then I'm going to be using the inner pieces to kind of create the rings from the wood of the tree. Now I'm going to emboss them using the rubber embossing mat in my die cutting machine. So I'm going to place all of these dies onto this piece here. Now you could do this right in your machine, right on top of the rubber mat. I'm doing it off of my machine, obviously, first, and then I will go and add it to the rubber mat in my machine. I don't bother taping anything in place, because when I go to emboss it, I can always make sure that none of the dies are overlapping, make sure that they're exactly where I want them to be before doing that embossing. So I have my machine here. I'm going to use the stacking for embossing a die. I have my rubber mat there that I put on the bottom. Sometimes when I'm embossing, I will put the rubber mat on top, and sometimes I'll put it underneath. For this, because I have the dies on top of the cardstock and I want to make sure that they're in place before I do my embossing, I have that rubber mat underneath, and then I use the embossing plate on my die machine. Now here we have that piece there. You can see how much texture you get from it. Embossing a die is a great addition to using your die cuts, and it gives you some really interesting and unique looks. It has a completely different look to it than using an embossing folder. It doesn't work with every single die set, but it is fun to use, and I just thought it looked really cool for this to add those just different unique layers. This is a background piece to my card, so it doesn't need to be perfect. In order to enhance those layers and that embossed texture, I did use some Vintage Photo Distress ink on that piece before I started to assemble my die cuts here. So once again, I have more of those lilies that I'm going to be die cutting. You can see that these were one of my favorites for the main images for these pieces here. So I have them on my tacky mat. I'm using that Summer Garden on my greenery and my leaves, as well as the little flower bud. Then for these florals, I'm going to be using that pink champagne on the center of the flower. And then for the outer edges of the flower, I'm going to be using some opal blush. So we're going to have the bright pink on the inside. The opal blush is a blue that has some pink interference, so the shimmer color is pink to it. If you've never seen interference inks worked before, I have a whole playlist with videos where I use them. They're one of my favorite inks because they just work like magic. They have one color that shows up on white or light cardstock and a completely different color that shows up on black or dark cardstock. So I really love playing with them. And even when using them just as plain inks for ink blending, like I'm doing with this video, they have a gorgeous shimmer to them. So it has a completely different look to it than, say, just using some distress ink or just using some plain dye-based ink blending ink. And I just really love the finish. I love the added shimmer to it that you get, and the colors are nice and vibrant. So once I have those pieces ready to go, we're ready to assemble our card. I'm going to be using this wood piece, or this ripped circle piece, for the background of my card. I want to be very generous with the glue on it because of all that texture from embossing those dies. I want to make sure that some of those recessed pieces get contact with my card base. So I am generous with that glue. Then I add my little vase, and then we can add our Stargazer pieces to that. Once I have all of these pieces on there, I'm going to put my acrylic block on there to hold everything down, just to make sure that everything has good contact with the piece below, so that we have some good adhesion to this card. I have that hugs piece there, die cut out of that solid hot foiled piece once again. I tried to get as many sentiments out of that as I could, and then went to add that sub-sentiment to it. I put it towards the right side of that sentiment. It just looked a little bit wrong, looked a little bit lopsided, so after that I moved it. Then I wanted to add just a little bit of sparkle, so I just added a bit of stickles to the centers of the lily there. I did it for some of the flowers. I didn't do it for all of them. I don't think it really needs it because we have that solid hot foiled piece there. It has some flash to it as well, but sometimes I just find that it needs that extra little bit of texture you get from the stickles, that extra little bit of sparkle. I'm using the same Ripped Circles die set for this next card, but instead of embossing it, I have two different layers, one die cut out of Fawn Cardstock, one die cut out of Acorn Cardstock, and I'm just creating the wood slice look on its own, just with those two pieces there, with a little bit of ink blending from Vintage Photo Distress Ink, then assembling the difference, the vase as well as my sentiment here. Once again, I have the foliage branch from the Containers and Foliage die set. I'm going to change it up just a little bit from the last time I used it. I'm going to start off with that Summer Garden Interference. I love the look of that on that Rainforest Cardstock, but I really like the look of the blue interference from the Summer Garden, so I wanted to enhance that a little bit. So I'm using the Opal Blush. So that's just going to deepen the blue color that we have on the base of the leaves. I'm using my detailed ink blending brush so that I have a little bit of control when I'm doing that. And I really love the look or how that enhanced it just a little bit more. Here you can see the two of those together, and you can see that it just deepens the ink blending on the base of those leaves. So just because you used interference ink on there doesn't mean you can't use another color on there just to deepen it up a little bit. And for my last card, I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to go even a step further. So you'll see that in another way as well. Then I can add my little branch piece on top of that, and it just adds a lot of detail. Having that extra little piece for the branch really does add a lot of detail to that background. Now, my pieces for this were a little bit too big, but I think this Ripped Circles die set would make a really fun shaped card. Obviously a lot smaller than an A2 card, but really fun for, say, like a little gift card with something. I think it could be a really unique look to it. There's one edge of that Ripped Circles that's got a little bit of a flat edge to it, and for layering those pieces together, that's the part of that die set that I used as a guide to know how it would layer together or how those layers would go together well. And I think that area that is a little bit more on the flat side, it's only about an inch or whatever, but it's got just that little flat. I think that would be great for the bottom of the card so that it wouldn't kind of rock and roll, but something different. So this is a different idea. I didn't do it here because, again, my pieces were a little bit big and I didn't think it was going to really work with it, but another option on how to use it. For the last two cards, I'm going to be using the Open Lace Frame and Landscape die. For the first one of the two, I'm going to be creating that landscape. So I have all of my pieces die cut here. I'm just using a little bit of that interference ink to ink blend on there. Now you can see my dark green piece there has a little notch out of the bottom. I couldn't get it in the scrap of cardstock that I had there, but it's going to have that lighter green piece layered on top of it, so we're never going to see that notch out of there. So sometimes when I'm die cutting, if something is layered on top of there, I don't worry about it because it's going to be hidden anyways. For my Hugs sentiment here, that's just die cut out of white cardstock, and I'm using that pink champagne on top of it to make sure that it coordinates nicely with my lilies for this card. Once again, adding those to my tacky mat, using that detailed ink blending brush to ink blend in the center of those florals before I go to assemble them. Now, I use those interference inks for ink blending my background pieces and the sky piece on the background that you can see still on the mat there. And you can actually really see the pink interference from that ink in the video right now. If you don't want that interference in the background, obviously you could swap it out with just some dye-based ink blending inks, but I already had those inks out and I didn't really want to have like 1,000 different inks used in this video, so I wanted to see how it would look for that background, and I really like the look of it. It might not be for everyone and it might not be for every single card, but for something a little bit different, because I don't typically use it for an entire background piece like this that the sky would be. I just thought it was fun. So after doing the pink champagne on the centers of these florals, I used the Fruit Salad, which is more of a coral color, for the outer edges of these lilies. And I just really like the look of that pink with that coral color. I thought it was really, really pretty. Then we are ready to start assembling our pieces and assemble our card. So I'm going to start with adding that little bud to one of our stems, and then we're going to assemble our flowers together, putting that little center part, that little the center of the flower on at first, and then we can add our layers to each other. So the florals are really, really easy to put together because the underneath layer has the exact same shape to it. So it's really easy also to know exactly where each piece is supposed to go. When it comes to layered sets, sometimes it's a little bit more challenging to know where the different pieces are supposed to go. So it's always nice when you have the odd set where it's really, really easy. They just stack up together and you know exactly which pieces are supposed to go where. And there's not really a whole lot of thought and problem solving to go with it. Now I want my background piece to coordinate with the lilies. So I'm going to start off with the fruit salad on the edges of those little open lace pieces on the scallop pieces on the outside part of it. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to put the pink champagne on the inside. So we have a combination of that pink on there with the coral color right on the outside piece. So it echoes the blending on the flowers. You can see that I need to re-ink my pink champagne pad as well. Didn't really realize how much it needed re-inking until I was doing this ink blending here. Now this landscape pieces are going to go in the center here, so I don't have to ink blend all the way to the center. That part is going to be covered completely, so I'm only doing it around the outside edges, just concentrating on blending into that fruit salad ink, working in a clockwise and counterclockwise motion, because sometimes when you're working just one way, that ink kind of pools or is a little bit heavier on one side than the other, and we want it to be a little bit more even. Now to continue that blend, I went and grabbed that fruit salad pad once again and then went over top of the pink champagne with that to make sure that both colors were blended together well. And now we're ready to start adding our layers for the landscape on top of that open scallop piece. So I'm going to add that cloud piece first on top of our base layer, then the darker of the two hills, and then add the little grass piece beneath. There's one other piece for that landscape that you can add if you want, and I really like the look of this just kind of as a landscape. On the front of the package, it looks almost more like a beachscape, so you can get creative with that as well. Now, the landscape pieces or the border pieces in this die set are longer, so they would work with a horizontal card as well. So you could do, I did them here vertically, but you could do them on a horizontal rectangle of this as well. So there's more options than just this, and perfect for when you want to create a scene card. I love being able to create simple layers for the background to echo a scene that isn't super complicated. And you can use a bunch of them together, or you could use the individual pieces separate. So you have a lot of different ways that you can use it here. While waiting for my background to dry, I'm adding the 2 layers to my Hugs die set, and now we're ready to add them to our A2 card base. So you can really get an idea of the size of this when you put it right onto the A2 card base. It's probably about a 1/2 inch smaller both ways, so it works well on the base of the card, but you could also easily use it as to create a shaped card, which is what I'm going to do for my last card, because I just like the look of that shape and I like the look of the open lace to it. So here we have our finished card, and all of those pieces are ink blended with interference ink, so they all have some shimmer to that, which I think is really, really pretty. And again, if you don't want all of it to shimmer, you can easily just use some of those areas or ink blend some of those areas with just some plain ink instead. So first of all, for my shaped card here, I'm going to take my 3 leaf sprigs. I'm going to start off with that summer garden. I'm going to repeat the same as the last leaf sprig and then go and do some of that opal blush on the base of the leaves just to deepen that blue. Then after doing that, I thought it would be fun for the tips of the leaves to have a different color as well. So after doing the opal blush here, I'm going to take that fruit salad and put it on the tips of the leaves, and we get a little bit more of an autumn type look where the leaves look like they're changing colors a little bit, which I really like the look of that as well. But I really love the look of that opal blush on the base of these leaves. It just deepens the color tone, and I think it looks really, really great on there. You definitely want to be using the detailed ink blending brush for this, because you want to be able to have control and be able to just put it on the base of the leaves rather than having it go too far on there. So once we have that done, I'm using that fruit punch there. So here we're going to see a little bit of that coral color, but it's going to combine with the green of the cardstock. We're also going to see some of that gold shimmer to it. So it just deepens the colors, changes it up just a little bit, and I really love the look of that. I am moving it in a different area on my tacky mat though, because I don't want to accidentally pick up the summer garden and opal blush ink that is on my tacky mat on my brush there. I don't want to contaminate them, so I move it to a different spot. Now here is where we're going to create the card base. I just used a piece of cardstock that was already created as a card base. Obviously you don't need to do that. You could just use 2 different A2 pieces of cardstock for die cutting, and then put that die on there, run it through the machine. Now, because I was running it through the machine straight on, I had a little bit of a difficult time the first cut. So this is where using smaller pieces and being able to angle them on your machine would definitely be helpful. It went through, but anytime you have a larger die with a kind of an area straight edge that machine is going over all at once, it does tend to be a little bit more difficult. So I definitely recommend going on an angle to make it a little bit easier for your machine. Once I have those 2 pieces cut, I'm using my score pal to score it at about 4.5 inches. Then I am folding it, making sure that we have some nice good fold there, using some glue on top of that score line, and then matching those 2 die cuts up there to create that card base. So once we have that done, I'm going to put my acrylic block on there, make sure everything is absolutely lined up. Because of the unique shape of this, you definitely would see if it wasn't lined up properly. So you want to make sure that that's totally lined up. I created a barrel for this. I just did that off screen. It's exactly the same as the other one that I created on screen here. And then I'm just going to add our little leaf pieces to this. So I left the spine pieces off of these ones, or the branch piece off of these leaves. You absolutely could put that on there if you wanted to have that extra detail to it. I wanted to show a couple different ways of using it with the spine and without the spine. Now, when I assembled my barrel, that solid background piece, I put it on before assembling my card, so I couldn't really tuck those leaves into the barrel. Rather than worrying about it, I just use my scissors to trim them down, and then I'm using the sew from my sentiment to hide any possible imperfections there. And I'll often do that rather than, or if there's an imperfection, I'll just use something else to hide it. It's all creative problem solving in the end. But I was going to cover that part with the sentiment anyways, and it just works out that way. So here is that shaped card base, perfect for those layering die cuts or those unique larger dies. It's a great way to just change your card up a bit, and it only takes a few minutes to create a shaped card base, but it just changes up the look of your card by having that shaped card base rather than the plain A2 card base. And here we have that same die set used on top of an A2 card base, all with colored cardstock that is ink blended with interference inks. Then we have our little foliage piece in a vase on top of the rip circle edge piece, as well as our embossed rip circle edge. And you get a completely different look with this than just the layers on top of each other. So a great way to use that die in a different way. Then we have the card with the lattice cut out of the front of the card. Another way to just change up the front of your card just a little bit. And then the first one where we use the different layers on top of an A2 card base. And again, that has a completely different look to it than the one where we're cutting those pieces out of that card base. And then we have the card created with the garden planter die set. And you'll find all of the products and die sets that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Once again, the very first card here with those stargazers, just everything put right onto the front of that A2 card to get a really simple but beautiful look to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spent with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.